The street lights come on, it's getting dark. She's supposed to be home before the street lights come on. She wasn't home yet, so I'm thinking she's just out there playing with a friend. She never came home.
She should be playing with a friend. She should be going to school and enjoying herself, not strangled, murdered, and treated like a piece of garbage.
Seeing her laying there smoldering is tore you up. It's one of those cases that never leave you. And Stanley's making sure of that.
There's no doubt whatsoever in my mind or heart that they have the right man.
He looked at and or processed 10,000 items of evidence and never found anything that connected Jennifer and Stanley.
I mean, I like cheese, but I'm not a rat. I like kids, but not like that.
You're listening to Suspect Convictions, a podcast from WVIK and Scott Reeder. I'm Lacey Scarmana. This week, we're talking about media coverage of the murder of Jennifer Lewis and the prosecution of Stanley Liggins, from the night of the murder all the way to coverage of the upcoming third trial. And that includes looking at the work we're doing in this podcast. And just to be clear, we are not setting out to prove Stanley's guilt or innocence. That's the role of the courts, not the press. In fact, you've probably noticed that I'm not weighing in on any of the topics we've presented. You get to hear from the actual lawyers or other people close to the case. This case will have a resolution in a few months, so we're sharing the facts and not bogging the podcast down with our amateur legal knowledge. Journalists provide a public service. We have the responsibility of holding government accountable. That includes the judicial branch. Al Tompkins is on the senior faculty for broadcasting and online journalism at the Poynter Institute in St. Petersburg, Florida. Poynter is an organization that trains journalists. Al Tompkins says journalists in the United States are allowed to report on court proceedings, something that doesn't happen everywhere in the world.
It's important that we remember that we have an open court system, and it's open for a reason. You ought to be able to see the wheels of justice in motion, because when you don't, there's a lot of reasons to suspect it's not going well. So I believe that an open court system, a way of offering transparency, also is a way of inspiring trust in the system, that it is going the way it should be going. When things start turning secret, I start getting suspicious, and history would say rightfully so.
Thanks to that transparency, journalists can observe the system and report the facts. We follow a code of ethics that guides us to be accurate, fair, objective, and transparent. We seek to minimize harm, and we take responsibility for the work we put out there. It's important to remember that the so-called media also includes writers and broadcasters that aren't objective journalists. These are commentators and pundits that do share their opinions or try to lead audiences to a specific opinion or conclusion. One example is a local conservative talk radio host here in the Quad Cities. Jim Fisher has one of the most popular shows in the area. He's been broadcasting for decades and has a huge following. And he has a lot of opinions about Stanley Liggins.
I lived here in this market and was doing talk radio 26 years ago when this happened. And this was a singularly beastly killing. I look at people like Stanley Liggins as, well, can I say scum of the earth in public broadcasting? Well, see, this is talk radio, and I get to say that killer's coming up for trial in May again, because he's been found guilty of murder in the first degree twice. Guess what? I'm saying something that's true. Now, in court, you can't say that.
I bring this up to emphasize that the First Amendment protects free speech, and that's great. But it can be confusing when you're looking for accurate information. When it comes to news coverage, our job as journalists is to present the facts. That's why we've spent so much time poring over courtroom testimony, reading police reports, and interviewing people related to the case. For Scott Reeder, this process started when he was reporting for the Quad City Times the night of the murder in 1990.
Normally, you go to a crime scene, you gather the information, you go back, and you write the story. In this particular instance, it was necessary for me to remain at the crime scene and radio information back to the newsroom. And someone in the newsroom wrote the story as I radioed back the information.
Tom Schnee was a reporter for the Moline Dispatch and Rock Island Argus newspapers. He didn't know what to expect when he got there.
Just walking around, I had no idea what I was looking for. And it was dark, and so I couldn't really see anything. And I was just walking around, and then I remember an officer yelling at me, "Stop, don't move." And I didn't know why, and then they came over to me, and I had almost stepped on the body.
Tom said the police set up crime scene tape around the body. He didn't have much time to process the shock of what had happened before he got to work reporting.
The police had given the first statement, and I went back and just wrote up what I had seen and some of the things that I had seen there, and just left that there for it to be added to the story the next day. I just remember, walking around trying to get some color and things like that, and just talking to people, and nobody knew what was going on. Nobody really had any idea. If they did, they certainly weren't going to tell me. But I just remember it being very somber, and I think a lot of people had the same kind of shocked sensation that I had.
Photographers and television reporters arrived too and began capturing images of the scene. Lisa Taranto was a reporter for WHBF Channel 4.
I knew that there was something bad happening at the school. We got the call. We went out there, and unfortunately, I was able to see the young girl, and it was just horrible. I mean, you never can be ready for something like that. It's very, very sad. And as a reporter, you're supposed to say, unbiased and hardened, and that was one of the things that did shape me to kind of put that barrier up. But, you're a human being, and it's kind of hard to just shake that off. It was really, really horrific. That was my first job, so I just got out of college, and I don't remember jumping right back into that reporter mode. It was tough. I think I remember walking away and just kind of having to collect my thoughts, and I kind of wept for this poor young girl.
In the first episode of our podcast, Scott Reeder described what he remembered from that night. One detail he mentioned is that the TV reporters went live from the scene and broadcast video of the body. A couple days after the murder, Russ Scott, who was the managing editor of the Moline Dispatch, wrote a column about journalistic standards when reporting on difficult topics. The headline was, "Jennifer's Death Tests the Media and Teaches Us Lessons." He wrote that many people in the community, including him, found out about the murder by watching the 10 o'clock news and seeing the gruesome images on their television screens. Russ Scott passed away almost 5 years ago, but we talked to Roger Ruthart, who was the managing editor of the Rock Island Argus. The Dispatch and Argus combined several years ago, and Roger is now the managing editor of the whole paper. He read an excerpt from Russ's column describing the impact of these images.
I still cringed personally and professionally when live shots of the child's smoldering body flashed upon my screen. The victim's body was clearly seen. Many would argue it shouldn't have been.
Russ Scott didn't mention the specific channel he was watching. Lisa Taranto, the Channel 4 reporter, doesn't remember whether her cameraman zoomed in on the body. She doesn't even really remember reporting live from the scene. But she does say live reporting carries extra pressure.
If something was shown that shouldn't have been, sometimes it is just an accident. You don't realize the cameraman, zoomed in or panned off. You don't try to not do that and respect what's happening behind you. But when it is fast and it's live and you're reporting, without having all the information, they just want to get it on right away. Sometimes that does happen. I think today I would probably be better at that because of the experience. But, the Quad Cities, that's when a lot of reporters are just first cutting their teeth, so they're still new to it. So that could have happened, which would be horrible, but you're going to make a mistake. But I think it's what you learn from that mistake, and that's what you carry with you, and that's when you make better decisions, and you're more cautious about what you're showing, what you're saying. You have to remember these victims are someone's daughter, someone's mom, it's a family member of someone. You have to keep that in mind always. And you always have to juggle the producer who's in your ear saying, we need this, show us this, and what's right. And that is where you find good reporters and not such good reporters. You have to know where to draw the line.
The column in the Dispatch also explored how journalists approach difficult topics in general. Here's Roger Ruthart reading another excerpt.
Reporting a crime this heinous carries both tremendous impact and heightened responsibility for the media. The story is sensational on its face, and the media need add only rock-solid reporting to fulfill its role in public expectations.
Roger says newspaper reporters and editors have more time to make sensitive news decisions, and that their choices are perhaps even more critical than for other forms of media.
When we publish a photo in print in the newspaper, it's there for an eternity. You know, TV is here, it's gone, and nobody's going to go to the library and pull up microfilm of, you know, that day's newscast, but they can go look at that day's newspaper and the photos and things that ran in it. So there's definitely a feeling of, you know, what we're doing, whatever decision we make today is sort of a decision for the ages, and we better get it right.
But today, it's much easier to re-watch videos on the internet, and the decision to go live isn't just left to the television stations. Al Tompkins from Poynter explains how journalists today are tasked with more ethical considerations when covering a story.
They might be Facebook Live, they might be, you know, live on some feed out of their camera, and that's going to become an increasingly large consideration, is that journalists are going to be live all the time, or they could be live all the time, or people who aren't necessarily journalists could be live all the time. You can cause great harm, obviously, by showing things that are unnecessarily graphic and disturbing. And so that's something for us to consider.
On the night of the murder, Gary Cramback was the photographer on the scene for the Dispatch. By the time he got there, police had blocked off the area around the body, so he had to stay further back. He describes the image they ended up printing in the paper the next day.
It was just basically like 2 or 3 people looking over the body with the spotlight. There was like a part of a fire truck or ambulance in the foreground, and that was probably about the clearest shot there was.
Todd Meisner was another photographer for the Dispatch. He did not photograph the crime scene that night, but he has been in situations like that before. He stresses the importance of capturing everything you can in that moment.
You can't go back and take a picture that happened, but you can decide not to run it. So you have to take it. And I teach every young photographer that works for me, take the picture. Even if it makes you uncomfortable to take the picture, take the picture.
That includes taking graphic photos that an editor would hopefully never choose to run in the paper. But Todd says they still serve a purpose.
If the picture that's before me is too graphic for us to run, I still have to shoot that picture. But then I have to be smart enough to find an angle to shoot that same picture from an angle that isn't graphic, so that picture we can run. I have to give my editors 2 shots, one that we could run and one that showed us what was going on so that we could all understand it. And you take them for historic purposes or evidentiary for a reporter to look at later, or just to remember the scene to be able to describe it or understand it.
In the days and weeks after the murder, there was a lot of follow-up reporting. As Scott Reeder explains, Jennifer's death deeply affected the community.
This was a big story at the time. Yeah, I remember the story moved on the wires. It was statewide news. People were interested in it, and people were compelled by it. It never made the national news like the death of John Benet Ramsey or something like that. It was big news at the time. I think it's one of the most horrifying murders that have happened in this area for the last 30 years.
Barb Ickes is a reporter for the Quad City Times. She explains why people in the Quad Cities paid such close attention.
Well, I mean, there are certain things that stand out, I think, to everybody. You know, where the body was found, the fact that it was a schoolyard is just troubling, of course. The age of the victim, and the way whoever did this to her, the way he treated her was heinous. It was very upsetting.
On the day of Jennifer's funeral, reporters and photographers from all the local media outlets showed up. Mary Maxwell Rockwell, Jennifer's godmother, doesn't remember a lot of details from that day, but she does remember the media's presence.
We showed up. I remember being a passenger. I honestly couldn't even tell you who drove me. I remember the car literally was put in park and the engine shut off when I had a reporter at the side of my door trying to help me out of the car, starting to talk to me. I just wanted to get in the church. I just wanted to do what we were there to do, and that was to respect Jennifer, to lay her to rest, and to turn her over to the Lord Jesus for her eternal life.
Mary and Jennifer's family and friends were put in an uncomfortable position that day. Their grief was on display for anyone in the community who watched the news or read the paper. But Mary is, perhaps surprisingly, pretty understanding.
I totally understand and respect that the media has a job to do. I respect that. We did respectfully ask that the media stayed out of the church, which they did, and I appreciated that. Then again, after that, we went to the cemetery.
Again, the media was asked to stay away from the actual ceremony at the cemetery, which was held in a small tabernacle at the entrance.
And I just remember the row of reporters up against the fence on the border of this cemetery as we were getting out of the car, going in, coming out, just looking up and seeing, which I'm sure was probably 15 or 20, but what seemed like hundreds of just cameras and people, and just, it was hard for us to do what we needed to do and grieve. On that one day, I just kind of wish they would have backed off a little bit, but they did. They stayed out, but they were very present.
Todd Meisner, one of the photographers from the Dispatch, has covered many funerals. He wasn't at Jennifer's, but he knows what it feels like to stand in that group Mary described.
Funerals are really uncomfortable. They're really uncomfortable. It's an unnatural act to stand out someone's funeral and wait for them to come outside. But I just have a strange ability to be able to completely block it out and know where the fine line is of respectful and not respectful, and try to maintain that line. It comes with experience, and it comes with, I think, a base instinct that you know what the right thing to do is, when to put your camera down, when to point your camera. You don't want to make anybody upset. It's easier when you're in a big gaggle of media because you're lost as an individual in the middle of all these other cameras. And so sometimes you move away from the pack and you slide down to get a different angle or something. You see something that makes a better picture. And what makes things newsworthy? Well, the murder of a 9-year-old girl is certainly newsworthy. We talked to the funeral home and asked them, what does the family want? What is the family comfortable with? And we respect those wishes. We're not going to do something to make it worse. They've already lost somebody, so we're not there to add to their grief. We're there to tell their story and shed some light on who that person was that was lost.
And as somebody close to Jennifer, Mary says she does appreciate that aspect of the media, that by reporting and documenting these significant moments, they can help the community remember.
There's a lot of human side in the media. There's a lot of good people. There's a lot of people that want to help keep her memory alive. And it's just like any other occupation, any other race, religion. There's good and there's bad, and I try to seek out the good. I've also worked with Barb Ickes over the Times pretty frequently. I think she's a very, very good reporter.
Barb Ickes lived in the Quad Cities at the time of the murder, but she didn't report on it. She wrote a story marking the 20th anniversary of Jennifer's death. That was in 2010, before Stanley Liggins had been granted his most recent appeal, before they realized this story would resurface in such a big way. When I first started researching this case, I came across that piece Barb wrote in the Quad City Times. It was powerful from the very start. I asked Barb to read the lead of that story.
She was counting down the days until her 10th birthday. When it finally came, they buried her. I guess I didn't realize there was so much written about this case, and I guess I didn't realize the precise timing of this for her birthday. And kids so look forward to their birthdays, especially, gosh, it's going to be your double-digit birthday. And for Mary and for sure the family, those are the kinds of details that hang on for them. They remember that she didn't get to have her birthday. And when she told me that, that she was buried then, boy, that grabbed me, and I knew it would grab others.
The rest of the story captured the emotion that Mary and the family still feel. Barb says she was a bit nervous going into the interview.
I'm always nervous when I go to an interview like that. I think it's partly because I'm not sure who's going to cry first, the source or me, because I just am kind of that way. So I never let a source cry alone. So I'm always just a little bit nervous about that. How are they going to take it? But it went great. She was as kind as she could be, and of course just full of memories.
There are two ways to approach a situation like this. Some reporters try to put up a wall to hide their emotions. Barb does the opposite.
When you go into an interview with somebody like Mary, who 20 years later is still hurting and is still going to get upset, if you can't respect that and go along with it, you shouldn't be there. And it's easy for me to feel the emotion of other people. I don't know if that's a curse or a gift, but it seems to work out okay.
I think it's safe to say anyone would be moved by the death of a child. I've been emotional talking with Mary as well. But on the other side of this tragic story was the legal process that followed. This kind of reporting requires more restraint. A suspect in a crime, even after they've been charged, is still innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. Journalism ethics demand the media honor that fact and present the information objectively. Al Tompkins from the Poynter Institute says journalists in the United States have a dual function.
One is to hold the system accountable and to examine whether the system is doing what the system is supposed to be doing, rendering fair trials, due process, and also to remember that part of our role is to inform the community.
After a quick break, we'll continue discussing how journalism plays a role in the legal process.
Thank you for going on this journey with us to try to better understand what really happened to Jennifer Ann Lewis and help all of those involved to reach closure and ultimately justice. If you would like access to more pictures, case files, and evidence relating to this case, please take a moment to complete a survey. Go to suspectconvictions.com/survey. It will only take about 30 seconds, and we will send you the case files, the pictures, and the evidence on the case. Again, that's suspectconvictions.com/survey.
You're listening to Suspect Convictions. I'm Lacey Scarmana. The day after Jennifer Lewis was murdered, Moline Dispatch photographer Todd Meisner covered the press conference with Davenport police. Reporters and cameramen were crammed into a small room at the police station. Lieutenant Don Schaefer entered the room carrying an envelope in one hand and Jennifer's school photo in the other. Todd's job was to get an image that captured the tone of that meeting.
He kind of looked around as to where to put this photograph, and before he sat down, he decided to use one of the reporters in the room, their tape recorder, as the easel. So he propped it right up in the front and sat down at all the television microphones. And I had been sitting up in the front and decided that I needed to move to the back because I wanted to compress with a longer lens in a shorter depth of field the picture of Jennifer with Lieutenant Schaefer in the background. And I sat with my camera trained vertically, focused on Jennifer's picture, waiting for Lieutenant Schaefer to react or emote or something. And eventually he kind of put his hand up to his head because it was overwhelming. I've never seen police officers so shaken by a case, a murder. It was early in my career. I started in '89, and this was 1990, so I wasn't at the paper very long when this happened. But I hadn't seen it, and I still haven't seen it, all these years later. You don't see it very often, and it's stuck with me all these years, this picture, her little school picture, and this, police officer, upset in the background.
When reporting on crime, reporters have a lot of questions, and the police often have the answers they want. At times, this can lead to tension, as both parties are trying to do their jobs. Kevin Murphy was a detective in the Jennifer Lewis case.
The media really didn't like me, and I wasn't a big fan either. I consider themselves vultures. They're eating off somebody else's sorrow, and if it didn't, they wouldn't have a story.
But that mentality didn't necessarily reflect the whole department. Some reporters developed good relationships with the officers. Scott Reeder reported on the police department for a few years at the beginning of his career.
I'd walk back into the detective bureau and talk to each of the detectives, see what they're working on. I'd usually drop off a copy of the paper for them to read. We had much more access to the people actually doing the job.
And Lisa Toronto from Channel 4 says she had a pretty good rapport with officers in the department.
They were very open, very fair to reporters. You kind of build a trust between police officers and county attorneys in previous stories. If you report fairly and accurately and don't jump the gun and you have a respect for them, they have a respect for you, you can report the news quite fairly and honestly if you can have an open line of communication.
Lisa remembers when the police arrested Stanley Liggins for Jennifer's murder.
It was outside the courthouse, and we were outside, and they were bringing him in, and that was the famous. I had asked him a question, something along the lines of, "Did you do this to this little girl?" And he professed his innocence, and no, I didn't. And then he turned and he looked at me, and it was really creepy. And I had a white shirt on and suspenders at the time, and he looked at me. And he was, "How you doing, suspenders?" So that was kind of horrifying to think that here's this guy saying, you're accused of murdering a little girl, and yet you're looking at my outfit.
That made her uncomfortable, but she had to stay objective while reporting.
That's probably the hardest thing to do, especially, I remember going in the neighborhood and interviewing people. There was some question as to whether or not he was the murderer at the time, because there was another person that was in the picture.
Some people Lisa interviewed suggested Jennifer's stepfather, Joseph Glenn, might have had something to do with the murder.
So I think I was able to maintain my, reporter's instinct, treat it as fairly as I could. So I went into it going, okay, there could be another person, and there's always that possibility. So you try you can't convict a person until obviously they go to trial.
Stanley went to trial in 1993 and 1995. The prosecution carries the burden of proof, meaning they have to prove the case to the jury beyond a reasonable doubt, and the defense works to discredit or cast doubt on the prosecution's case. Journalists observe both sides and report on them for their readers or viewers. Iowa courts lifted their ban on cameras in the courtrooms in the early 1980s. Then reporters could begin showing these images to their audience as well. Roger Ruthhart, the managing editor of the Dispatch and Argus, says this was a big plus.
I think the value to the cameras in the courtroom is that they actually can show the public how the judicial process works and how the cases are argued and how the judges, whether they command respect or not and things like that.
But former Scott County prosecutor Bill Davis disagrees.
If it was truly to educate the public on what happens in court, I would be all for it. But they're not, because they only show snippets of what goes on. You'll see a snippet of testimony, not even in context, and then you'll get some editorializing on it. No, I don't think it's informative at all.
Al Tompkins from Poynter says it's a duty of the press to show how the judicial system actually works.
The more the public gets exposed to that, as opposed to watching it on Perry Mason or Matlock, they're able to see that the system is vigorous, sometimes tedious. Sometimes the system renders verdicts that you don't understand. But the fact of the matter is, the system generally works when you apply it rigorously and you treat it seriously, and you're carefully considering evidence and procedure. And that's to everyone's favor.
Mark Rodolfi is the assistant editor of the North Scott Press, a paper that covers rural Scott County, Iowa. Mark says journalists provide a service to the community by covering the courts.
They need to tell the story as it's being told in court. They need to tell the story as it's being told in court. They need to tell the story as it's being told in court. They need to tell the story as it's being told in court. They need to tell the story as it's being told in court. They need to tell the story as it's being told in court. They need to tell the story as it's being told in court. They need to tell the story as it's being told in court. They need to tell the story as it's being told in court. They need to tell the story as it's being told in court. They need to tell the story as it's being told in court. They need to tell the story as it's being told in court. They need to tell the story as it's being told in court. They need to tell the story as it's being told in court. They need to tell the story as it's being told in court. They need to tell the story as it's being told in court. They need to tell the story as it's being told in court. They need to tell the story as it's being told in court. They need to tell the story as it's being told in court. They need to tell the sto provide some context for readers so the readers know why it's important, but they also need to cover the public officials whose role it is to bring justice in their community.
And former prosecutor Bill Davis was an elected public figure. Something that stood out in both trials was when the prosecution displayed the back end of Stanley Ligon's car in the courtroom to show that one taillight was brighter than the other, which matched the description provided by one of their key witnesses. Mark Rodolfi says that was an effective display that did get a lot of media coverage, but he says the display wasn't actually for the press or for the public.
I've seen Bill Davis work, and he can be a showman in the courtroom, or storyteller might be a better word. But I think his intent was probably solely for the jury, because at this point, and when it comes back, that's the people who count.
This case will be tried again in May. Pretrial motions are at the end of the month, and the case will once again be front and center in the Quad Cities media. Before he went to the North Scott Press, Mark Rodolfi was an editor for the Quad City Times. In 2014, when Stanley Liggins returned to the Scott County Jail to await his third trial, Mark wrote an editorial asking readers to look at the trial with fresh eyes.
And they're in a tough position because in our slow growth community where people are around for a long time, they remember the previous two trials. And in attempting to get a jury pool, they're going to have to find folks who can suspend that prior knowledge. But I think finding folks without prior knowledge is going to be next to impossible. So we raised the point that Stanley Liggins returns to Quad Cities an innocent man, as is every criminal defendant in the court. It's just different because our readers came with a different set of knowledge. So we talked about that and put the two trials that you've covered so well into perspective, that they were reversed on very, very specific errors, and wrapped it up saying the first time the jury heard too much, the second time the jury heard too little, and this time 24 years after neighbors reported smoke drifting from Jennifer Lewis's charred remains, we hope enough evidence remains to let the next jury find justice for a little girl mired in her hell of drugs and deception. Looking for justice, because that's what we're still looking for after all this time.
This week, we found out the defense filed a motion to change the venue outside of Scott County. We'll see how that plays out and learn more about the upcoming trial when pretrial hearings begin February 20th. Barb Ikes from the Quad City Times says the media has continued to adjust to the changing nature of the case. After Stanley was convicted, he was referred to as the killer, the man who did the crime. But then his case was under appeal, and now that his conviction has been thrown out, he's the accused. His fate is still uncertain.
It would be understandable and predictable for the public to presume him to be guilty. He's been convicted twice. I think people in the Quad Cities of any age remember the case, remember the details. But if they really look closely, they'll also have to recall that it was a almost entirely circumstantial case. So I'm sure that a lot of people go, oh no, Stanley Liggins again, haven't they sent him up twice? So I'm sure there's plenty of skepticism in the public. But on the news side, you have to treat it the way it is, which is right now up in the air.
Mary Maxwell Rockwell, Jennifer's godmother, has emerged as an unofficial liaison for the family between the prosecution and police and the media.
I don't know how I ended up the family spokesperson, but I did. And the prosecution feels comfortable with that, as does the family. I guess it all started when she died. I just said I would never, ever stop fighting for her as long as I had a breath in my body. And I guess being the spokesperson is as close as I can get to having any kind of input or sense of control over just a crazy, crazy situation.
In other episodes of this podcast, we've talked about the struggles of prosecuting this case nearly 27 years after the crime happened. But we're also reporting on this case in a much different era. We have the advantage of hindsight and the ability to reflect on actions and decisions made many years ago. We also have new technology. You can listen to us on your smartphone, you can discuss on social media, and you can Google the case for more information. Scott Reeder reflects on what has changed in the news business since he reported on that crime scene.
You know, one of the things that struck me, it would be so much different today, was once the Quad City Times went to press that night, there really wasn't a lot of need for me to stick around the crime scene very much longer because, there was no way to convey any more information to the readers. Now with the internet, they probably would have had me stay there for a couple of more hours just in case, something was discovered or something happened and we needed to convey that to our readers. And there's a lot, seems to be a lot more immediacy in the news business now than there ever was. And it's always been a very immediate business, but even more so today than there has been in the past.
Suspect Convictions isn't about me or even about Scott's connection to this case. It's about the ongoing prosecution of Stanley Liggins, a man who is getting a rare third chance for freedom. And it's about the tragic death of Jennifer Lewis, a little girl who wasn't allowed to grow up. Production support comes from Alfredo Montega. Big thanks to Colin Thompson and Cast Media for our online presence. You can go to suspectconvictions.com for more information. And thank you to WVIK CEO Jay Pierce and the WVIK staff. All archived audio was generously provided by WQAD TV, Channel 8.
Thank you for listening to Suspect Convictions. If you appreciate the work we do, please leave a rating and review it in iTunes to help us get discovered by more people and get the word out about the case of Jennifer Ann Lewis. Go to suspectconvictions.com/review to find out how to leave a review and get access to case files in exchange. That's suspectconvictions.com